Later, when he wanted his presidency to be remembered in history for its great civil rights legislation, Lyndon Johnson would often declare that he had, during his entire life, been free from racial prejudice. "I'm not prejudiced, nor ever was," he told one biographer. "I never had any bigotry in me. My daddy wouldn't let me." His biographers took him at his word, and so did his assistants. In a typical comment, one of hundreds, really, of similar comments from Johnson's aides, George Reedy says, "The man had less bigotry in him than anybody else I have ever met. Johnson had none in him, not racial, ethnic, or religious prejudices." So did his friends, or to be more precise, those of his friends to whom he talked liberal. "I'm telling you this man does not have prejudice," Helen Gahagan Douglas was to insist. Like everything else about Lyndon Johnson, however, the question of his prejudice wasn't so simple. While in Georgetown, he talked one way to men and women of liberal views, of tolerance toward human beings of other colors and persuasions, talked to them so passionately that they believed he was tolerant toward minorities, anxious to help them, waiting only for the right moment. Talked so passionately that even civil rights crusader Virginia Durr accepted his response to her reproaches about his long silence on civil rights. A comradely hug and an assurance that, "Honey, you're dead right. I'm all for you, but we ain't got the votes. Let's wait till we get the votes." He talked quite another way in Suite 8F of the Lamar Hotel in Houston to men of intolerance, to men who felt that Negroes and Mexican Americans were inherently dumb, dirty, lazy, stupid, looking only for handouts, gimmies, as 8F's presiding spirit Herman Brown called black Americans, and talked to them too so passionately that they believed he shared those feelings, shared them fully. Their beliefs about Lyndon Johnson, their descriptions of the way he talked to them, were not made a part of the journalism of the time or of the history that has been written about it, because these men, unlike the Georgetown liberals, did not talk to journalists or historians. For more than 20 years after they became legendary figures in Texas, Herman and George Brown tried to avoid giving interviews, and every time an historian proposed writing a history of Brown and Root, they blocked the attempt. But their opinion of Johnson's attitudes is just as strong as the liberals' opinion, and what they felt was that, while he had to be diplomatic and not express them publicly, his attitudes were the same as theirs. And although their names are not known to history as are those of the Washington liberals, they were just as close to Lyndon Johnson as the liberals were. Herman and George were the major financiers of his rise. Ed Clark, who bought a ticket on him in 1937, was his principal lawyer, and the man who kept Texas in line for him for 30 years. When Johnson left Washington at the end of each congressional session, it was to the watering holes of these men, Falfurrias, St. Joe, Fort Clark, that he repaired for the week-long whiskey-soaked hunting trips that played so crucial a role in his political career. His rise was financed by men so bigoted that to talk to them when their guard was down was to encounter a racism whose viciousness had no limit. Sitting in his apartment on Austin's 19th Street on the day that signs went up with the new name the Austin City Council had given the street, Martin Luther King Boulevard, Clark was so filled with rage that as soon as the author of this book walked in, Clark told a joke. "Did you hear about how the Reverend King went to Africa to look for his roots, but as he were climbing the tree, a baboon shat in his face?" During an earlier interview, Clark had been asked if Lyndon Johnson's views about Negroes and Mexican Americans were any different from his own. Smiling a slow, amused smile, he replied in his East Texas twang, "If there were any difference at all, it were not apparent to me." To take Lyndon Johnson at his word that "I never had any bigotry in me," it is necessary to ignore other words of Lyndon Johnson's. His own words, written in his handwriting in a private diary he kept, the only time he kept a diary, during the month he spent in the Pacific during the Second World War. To take him at his word, it is necessary to ignore still other words, words spoken in his own voice and preserved on a tape recording made not in the Oval Office with an eye on posterity, but by a Lyndon Johnson who thought no one was listening, not knowing that while he was talking to employees on his ranch over a radio telephone in 1967 and 1968, An Associated Press photographer, Steve Stibbons, assigned to take photographs for a feature story on Johnson, had found himself by accident listening to the conversations, and had decided to record them because, as he recalls, "I was so shocked, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I mean, this was the great civil rights president,